I prepared these comic pictures, and it's between Nike and Mikey, and it's quite similar to what Linda just said. Since China like to copy a lot of brand name, and you can see this by yourself. Okay, and the question you asked previous week is, if one company has registered its trademark in Taiwan, is it also useful around the world? Basically, the answer is no. And according to our law, the protection only can be in Taiwan. If you register your brand in Taiwan, you can only be protected in Taiwan. Okay. And the next question is, you wonder, is there any case in the end Apple won the case? Okay. And I found two cases, but actually Apple didn't win any case of trademark infringement. And first one is Apple iPad and China iPad. So when Apple want to sell their product iPad 2 in China, and they found they already have this the iPad, the name of iPad had already being registered, and in the end, the Apple company have to pay about more than $100 million to the China iPad. And the second case is Apple sue a company which is Polish online browser, APL, but it's a recently case, but so actually I didn't know what the final ending, so maybe you can keep an eye on it, okay? So.
I think the comics that Peggy provided is quite comical. I really like it. She didn't show it in detail. I think it's very interesting. You all know Nike and the trademark, right? And then this Taiwanese old man designed Mikey with two marks like this. This is a kind of promoting or giving knowledge to the public about not to infringe trademark rights. I think the comics are quite interesting, so this is for your information. Do you have your chapter 9 with you? If you do, please take it out and follow along while I am discussing chapter 9 on textual borrowing. I think this chapter is quite relevant to our topic today. In fact, this is not a new issue. If we compare Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra with T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, we can see these two versions here. The barge she sat in, like a burnished throne, burned on the water. Okay, that's Antony and Cleopatra. Now, the chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble. That's the wasteland. Do you see similarities between the two? Definitely. But now, the problem is, do you think T.S. Eliot copied Shakespeare when he wrote this very famous work? Well, the thing is, it wasn't a problem until our oral culture was replaced by written culture. It wasn't a problem before in many generations throughout the history when people transmitted information by speech, right? Throughout throughout the generations. There's no such a problem of intellectual property rights or who copied whom. But then when the written culture is replacing the oral culture in text, now we have the so-called textual borrowing. And now when the internet culture is replacing handwriting culture, there's another problem, right? Okay, so you can look at the site on intellectual property rights, and it describes the history of the whole issue. Our topic today is broader. We want to look at plagiarism. And next week, I'm going to ask Dr. Rao, who has been teaching scientific writing, to address the problem of plagiarism from a scientific writing teacher. Okay. But let's look at plagiarism in general, or textual borrowing. What's the definition? It says, at its simplest, plagiarism, or more accurately, the type of plagiarism linguists are competent to deal with, is the theft or unacknowledged use of text created by another. In other words, it's considered theft or unacknowledged use of another's text. And here it also says plagiarism is a form of cheating in which the student tries to pass off. Remember the word pass off from our last week's presentation. Pass off someone else's work as his or her own. However, typically, substantial passages are lifted verbatim, word for word, verbatim from a particular source without proper attribution having been made. That's the definition of plagiarism. So there are two concepts here. One is unacknowledged use. The second one is intentional. Tries to pass off, tries to make use of something that doesn't belong to you. Okay? However, it's not that easy. The problem is usually you don't copy things verbatim, word for word, right? You actually take the text and edit it a little bit. We have been doing it frequently when we write English essays, right? We edit something, sometimes superficially. Do you think that's counted as plagiarism? Although we are not copying words word for word or verbatim for long, text. However, we did some editing superficially. The second problem is, how do we know you are doing it intentionally? Right? But that's the second concept. Intentionally passing off somebody else's work. As a result, many universities cannot make the final decision whether you are really plagiarizing or not. And as a result, they simply ask you to sign some kind of statement claiming that you are not going to do it, because they have no way to judge whether you do it intentionally, whether you have done some editing superficially, or you have actually intentionally used something without acknowledging the source. Okay. There must be assumption behind the whole issue of plagiarism. That's the assumption. In other words, there's a principle of uniqueness of utterance behind the whole thing. Your writing must be unique. What does that mean? That means the overlap between the lexical-grammatic forms that you use should not overlap too much with mine if we both write substantially long. Okay? There shouldn't be complete overlap, or 90% overlap of all the vocabulary you use or all the grammatical forms you use. There shouldn't be substantial overlap, because according to uniqueness of utterance principle, here it says, here let's look at uniqueness of utterance principle from Chomsky and Holliday. We would expect that the same person speaking or writing on the same topic on different occasions would make a different set of lexical grammatical choices. A different set of lexical grammatical choices. All right? Based on this principle, how do we detect whether you have plagiarized something or not? We can look at lexical overlap. Okay? Lexical overlap. Now, there's software that we can use to detect whether there's substantial lexical overlap between your writing and somebody else's. It's called Copycat Gold. All right? After explaining what plagiarism is, I am going to explain a murder case in that chapter, which finally the person who was accused of murdering somebody was released because they realized that his confession was fabricated. Okay, how do we know his confession was fabricated? Now let's look at the case. This case says, in this case, 4 men were accused and subsequently convicted solely on the basis of the confession of one of them, whose name is Patrick Molly, of the murder of a 13-year-old newspaper delivery boy, whose name is Carl Bridgewater. There was no corroborating forensic evidence, and Molly later retracted his confession. Okay, he said, I didn't do it. I didn't confess it. But it didn't work because, okay, the case is, he admitted that he did actually say most of the words recorded as his confession, but insisted that he was being told what to say. Okay, that's important. He was being told what to say as he was dictating the confession by a policeman who was standing behind him. Right? He also claimed that he had only made the confession after being physically and verbally abused for some considerable time. In other words, his confession was forced, and he was forced to copy what the police asked him to say. Okay? So that's the point here. How do we know? How do we know what Molly said was true? Let's look at this. Of course, the police denied the existence of the other confession. And to reinforce the credibility of Molly's confession, produced a contemporaneous handwritten record of an interview which they claimed had taken place immediately beforehand and which contained substantially the same information expressed in words very similar to those of the confession. In other words, there is a police interview which occurred beforehand. And then based on the interview, they wrote the confession. Okay, so there are 2 documents. One is the interview, the next is the confession. But Molly said there's no interview. There's only a forced confession. Now the question is, how do we know there is no interview before? The interview was fabricated. Okay. Are you clear what the problem is? Now we want to determine if the so-called police interview, who was claimed to occur before the confession, really occurred. Okay? Or can we say that that interview was made up, was fabricated? Based on this so-called confession, we went back and create or recreate an interview. That's the point here. And how do we know that interview was created, was fabricated? Because there are 3 pieces of evidence which can show you that's recreated. All right, this is the so-called Molly's statement, which was you know, dictated, forced, word by word, okay? Now, I want to show you the made-up interview, the 3 places that I want to draw your attention. The first place is, let's look at, okay, maybe we should read it a little bit, because I don't think all of you have read this chapter ahead of time. Joe, would you be the police? Okay? All right, police. Would you be the police? Could you come over here? Would you read the police? And let me see. Edie, would you be Molly? Huh? No? Okay, I'll be Molly. I'll be Molly. Would you be the police?
How long were you in their pet?
I had been drinking and cannot remember the exact time that I was there. But whilst I was upstairs, I heard someone downstairs say, "Be careful, someone is coming."
Did you hide?
Yes, I hid for a while, and then I heard the bang I have told you about.
Carry on, pet.
I ran out.
What were the others doing?
The 3 of them were still in the room.
What were they doing?
They all looked shocked and were shouting at each other.
Who said what?
I heard Jimmy say it went off by accident. Let's pause here. Okay? Here. After we hear things like this, they all looked shocked and were shouting at each other. What would you expect the police to say? Ignore this. Just respond to the question. Yes, exactly. They all looked shocked and were shouting at each other. They should just say, what were they shouting about, right? Or what were they shouting at? Okay? However, it says, who said what? Look at the verb, shout versus say. And let's read the next one. I heard Jimmy say. Say. Okay, that's the first piece of evidence. In other words, this is from the previous statement, and we simply make up some questions to link these statements together, right? And the evidence, the first evidence is shout versus say. Next, he said, I heard Jimmy say it went off by accident. That's the first piece of evidence showing it's being fabricated. You go back to recreate a question, which doesn't really link nicely with the previous one, okay? Now, could you read the police?
Pat, I know this is upsetting, but you appreciate that we must go to the bottom of this. Did you see the boy's body?
Okay, now let me ask you, what would you predict when you hear something like this? Did you see the boy's body? What pronoun would you use? Did you see the boy's body? Yes, I saw it. Okay, that's the predicted pronoun, right? I saw it. Let's look at the answer. Molly hesitated, looked at me intently, and after pause said, yes, sir, he was on the settee. He. That's another piece of evidence. Okay? It's supposed to be it, but the previous statement, the previous statement had he somewhere. Where's he? He. I looked, and on the settee I saw the body of the boy. Okay? Now, next. So that's the second piece of evidence. It's supposed to be it, but you have he was on the settee. Next, police.
Did you see any injury to him?
Molly stared at me again and said, yes, sir, he had been shot in the head. Police.
What happened then?
Okay, what would you predict if a police asked you, what happened? What would you say? Don't look at this. What would you say? What happened? Stone?